Hello everyone, my name is Max Norris, and I have decided to focus my AP reading project on the connection between Cat's Cradle by Kurt-Vonnegut and the philosophical works of Albert Camus. Throughout this presentation, I will go through Kurt-Vonnegut's life, the plot of Cat's Cradle, the fundamentals of absurdism, and finally I will connect them using characterization and theme. And I think that's enough of the introductions, and let's jump right into it. To know a work, one must understand its author. The issue with Kurt Vonnegut is that he's not easy to understand, a fact he would come to satirize in his own life. He was born in Indianapolis to a middle-class family in 1922. We know he served in World War II, being there for the infamous firebombing of Dresden, an event that would come to affect him deeply. He would end up writing Slaughterhouse-Five, or The Children's Crusade, later in life, based off of it. After returning to the States, he moved to New York and started writing fiction full-time. We know he suffered with depression. He attempted suicide in 1984, but this did not stop him. Over the course of his life, he wrote 14 novels, 3 short story collections, 5 nonfiction titles, and 5 plays. Vonnegut died in 2007 at the age of 84. He is remembered as a well-respected author who tackled themes of existential dread and horror with trauma, wit, and personal experience. In 2010, the Kurt-Vonnegut Memorial Library was opened in his honor.
The story of Cat's Cradle is framed as a retrospective from the perspective of the main character, Jonah. The first 40 or so chapters consist of Jonah investigating a famous nuclear scientist, one Felix Honecker, for a novel he is writing called The Day the World Ended. His investigations lead him to Honecker's hometown, his old lab, and into contact with one of Honecker's children, Newt, who's a dwarf. His investigations also lead him to discover that before Honecker's death, he was working on a substance called Ice-9 that theoretically, when coming into contact with water, would convert it into a super hard form of ice with a high melting point. The plot of the novel really picks up when Jonah finds a lead that one of the Honecker children, Frank, was on the run from the law and escaped to the Caribbean island of San Lorenzo, where he has become the Minister of Science and Progress. Upon discovering this, Jonah gets on a flight to San Lorenzo, meeting an interesting cast of characters. First, the new U.S. ambassadors to the island, the Miltons. Then the Crosbys, a couple that are headed for San Lorenzo to establish a bicycle factory away from the unions and regulations of the state. The most important group on this flight, however, is Newt and Angela Honecker, who are headed to the island for their brother's wedding to the daughter of the island's dictator, Mona. Upon seeing a picture of Mona, Jonah falls in love. The tropical island of San Lorenzo is, on the surface, relatively beautiful. However, the people of the island live in almost perpetual squalor. The island itself is very light on natural resources, and it's overall just a horrible place to live. After arriving on the island, the group is greeted by Mona, Papa, the island's dictator, and Frank Honecker. Because of a seemingly random pain, Papa falls out, but before fully lapsing into unconsciousness, he names Frank his successor. After this event, Jonah and the Crosbys are sent to the only hotel on the island, run by Julian Castle, an incredibly rich man who grew up on the island and has gone slightly insane. While exploring the hotel, Jonah finds 2 hotel employees laying down on their back, touching feet. When they realize they are being watched, they panic and make Jonah promise he'll never tell anyone what he saw. Soon after this, Jonah receives a call from Frank saying that he needs to talk to him immediately. Quickly traveling to Frank's estate on the island, Jonah discovers that Frank is out, but his brother, Newt, is sat on the porch after painting a strange picture of a cat's cradle. This prompts a series of conversations between Newt, Angela, Jonah, and Castle that we will go into more during the analysis. During this conversation, Castle reveals that while the island's official religion is Christianity, no one actually follows it. Instead, they follow a local religion called Bokanism, established by the local holy man Bokanon, despite it being punishable by death if anyone's caught practicing. After this dialogue is finished, Frank comes back and has a private discussion with Jonah. in which he reveals that he does not want to be the island's dictator and offers the position to Jonah. Jonah is initially hesitant to accept until he learns that the next dictator of the island will marry Mona. Jonah immediately accepts and performs the Bokanist foot-touching ritual seen earlier with Mona. Pausing a bit here from the analysis, I'm fairly certain that Kurt-Vonnegut has a foot fetish, and I will not be going into it. After Jonah's foot fun time, he goes with Frank to witness Papa's last rites and attend his own coronation ceremony. This is also where we learn that Papa himself is a Bokanist, despite enforcing laws against it. The ceremony for Jonah's coronation starts and is going quite well until Jonah is called down to Papa's room. Papa has killed himself, mysteriously turning into a statue of warm ice. The doctor who is tending to Papa, a former Nazi, it's a whole thing, accidentally comes into contact with some of the ice around Papa, turning into a statue himself. Jonah manages to deduce that the hypothetical substance of Ice 9 was actually developed, and he immediately calls down the Honecker children. The children admit that before their father died, he managed to make a small quantity of Ice 9 that he divided between the three of them. Getting to work, they burn the body of Papa and stuff the doctor's body into the dresser, resolving to deal with it after the ceremony, as I'm sure we all have done at one point. This decision quickly comes back to bite them, as during the ceremony, an air show goes awry, causing a bomb to be dropped on the castle that this is all taking place in. The castle begins to tumble into the sea, bringing the body of the doctor down with it. The moment the doctor's body touches the ocean, all of the world's open water is turned to Ice 9, effectively ending civilization as we know it. It's this abrupt in the book, too. Jonah manages to escape to a bunker under the castle with Mona for a couple weeks. However, the pair eventually resolve to investigate the outside, finding everything frozen. While exploring the ruined island, they discover a group of islanders that have committed suicide with the ice, an act that Mona does as well after she realized Bokonon put them up to it. This devastates Jonah. He is found by a group of survivors consisting of Frank, Newt, and the Crosbys, and he survives with them for about 6 months. Each member of the group goes about their own devices. Hazel Crosby makes an American flag while her husband cooks. Frank sciences, Jonah writes, and little Newt paints. When Jonah and Newt are out looking for paint, they discuss the ways the world could have gone and the religion of Bokanism. Jonah has made it his mission to climb to the top of Mount McCabe, the tallest point on the island, but he breaks down trying to think of a symbol to bring with him. The book ends with the duo finding Bokonon sitting beside the road trying to think of the final words for his books of Bokonon. He settles on the following. If I were a younger man, I would write a history of human stupidity, and I would climb to the top of Mount McCabe and lie down on my back with my history for a pillow, and I would take from the ground some of that blue-white poison that makes statues of men, and I would make a statue of myself, lying on my back, grinning horribly, and thumbing my nose at you-know-who. Now, if you're a sane person, that was a bit weird, to say the least. One of the core things to remember about Cat's Cradle is that the plot is very much secondary to its ideas. Most of the characters in this story do not actually exist to be characters, they exist to represent ideas, and that's what I really want to focus on throughout the analysis. However, before I begin the analysis, I think it's important to acknowledge the lens I will be analyzing this book through. As of late, I've been reading some of the works of the French philosopher Albert Camus. Most importantly, his famous essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. So, before I begin the analysis properly, I want to take a second to talk about Camus, who he was, and what he believed.
Albert Camus was a middle 20th century French philosopher. He was born to a poor Algerian family when Algeria was still a colony in France. Also, his father died when he was at a very early age in war. These themes of death and misery would come to greatly affect his writings later in life. Despite his early setbacks, Camus excelled at academic study, eventually graduating from the University of Algiers with a degree in philosophy with a specialization in psychology. Now, Camus then moves to Paris at quite an inopportune time, as soon after the Nazis invaded. This would greatly affect him, however, because he would be the chief editor on the Parisian resistance magazine Combat, essentially a wing of the French resistance. Now, in this time, he would also meet an incredibly influential philosophical figure, that of Sartre, the father of existentialism. Camus was interested in existentialism, but he saw some problems in it, so he moved around, eventually deciding to make his own form of philosophy, absurdism. Now, what is absurdism? Absurdism centers around the philosophical idea of the absurd. The absurd is essentially an interaction between humans trying to find a meaning to the universe and the universe that is quite silent as to its meaning. Now, in one of his greatest essays, and the only essay that I have read, The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus proposes three options when someone is faced with the absurd. Option 1, suicide. Option 2, a leap of faith. Or option 3, absurdism. Suicide is presented as essentially admitting that life is not worth the effort. And the leap of faith is called a philosophical suicide. It is admitting that the weight of the absurd is too much and someone else must take it off of you. Now, the third of these options, absurdism, is presented as the only genuine option someone can take. Absurdism is the acceptance of the absurd, but the denial of the dejection that should come with it. In this, it is a revolt against the very idea of meaninglessness itself, and this noble struggle is presented as a way to bring value back to life, and a way to show the majesty of humanity.
The essay closes with an allusion to the Greek myth of Sisyphus, the man who, in defying the gods, is forever doomed to push a boulder up a hill, a boulder that will always end up rolling back down. This is a metaphor for life, for the constant struggle for meaning in a silent universe, for the absurd. As Camus puts it in his closing statement, I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burdens again. But Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity and negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe, henceforth without a master, seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain in itself forms a world. The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy.
So, how does this early 20th century French philosopher connect to Cat's Cradle? Well, in order to understand that, I think we're going to need to delve deeper into the characters of Cat's Cradle. Let's start out with Frank Honecker. Frank Honecker is one of the most simple characters in Cat's Cradle. Throughout several points in the novel, he is described as childlike, hunched over, and immature. The most important thing in this analysis is what ideas the characters are meant to represent. I believe Frank represents living life through science. In the actual plot, Frank is the Minister of Science and Progress on San Lorenzo, and he really only understands the world through scientific and empirical lenses. This is most exemplified near the end of the book, where the world has ended, and Frank has made it his mission, his goal, to understand how the ants are surviving. They're rubbing their bodies up to chunks of ice-9 to melt the water. But who taught them how to do this? But why would they do that? And who taught them to do this? And who taught them to do this? These questions compound and compound, and as he's describing this to Jonah, he goes more and more frustrated. Vonnegut, being Vonnegut, capitalizes on this by quoting his fictional books of Bokanon. Beware of the man who works hard to learn something, learns it, and finds himself no wiser than before. He is full of murderous resentment of the people who are ignorant, without having come by their ignorance the hard way. This is very reminiscent of Camus' view on science. He believes that while science is a good tool to look at the natural world, described here as phenomenon, but it can never truly show us why the world works as it does. It can never show us meaning, as he explains it. I realize that through science I can seize phenomenon and I can enumerate them. I cannot, for all of that, apprehend the world. Vonnegut and Camus come to a very similar conclusion on science. They both agree that science is a valuable way to learn about the natural world. However, they also believe that we can still not truly understand the world through science. It cannot truly grant us meaning. Newt Honecker, in my opinion, is one of the most difficult characters to understand. Physically, Newt's a dwarf. Many of the characters, because of his short stature, assume that he would be immature, especially his sister. But there's an argument that can be made that Newt's the most mature in the novel. At several points in the novel, Vonnegut uses Newt to introduce one of his main ideas. The painting, that's the namesake of the book, Cat's Cradle, was originally drawn by Newt. Newt's a very artsy type, painting at several points in the novel, an idea we're going to come back to a little later. Newt, I think, is meant to represent the ideal of the absurd person. He sees the stupidity, the meaninglessness, the absurdity around him, and instead of breaking to that or breaking to the strain, he accepts it. At no point in the novel is he destroyed by the things around him. He's always a voice of reason and calm in even like when the world literally ends. Again, he's normally judged immature and looked down on, and I think that's meant to be a metaphor for the struggle we all go throughout life, because all these characters are exaggerations. That struggle, people always thinking he's some child, ends up, he accepts that. And, as I said, this exemplifies the ideal of the absurd person. Bokonon is by far one of the most unique characters in the novel. Pretty much unlike any of the actual normal characters, he most purely represents an idea without kind of having a character of his own. We know he's a bit dastardly in his youth, and we know he's a veteran, but he only actually gets like 7 lines in the entire book, and they're all in the last chapter. So I'm going to kind of split this into Bokonism and Bokonon, because I think they're meant to be different. The infamous religion of Bokononism, it's weird, I don't know how to pronounce it, was actually invented by Bokonon to bring comfort to the people of the island. For similar reasons, he requested that it be made illegal, punishable by death, so that it would lend more credence to the narrative of the religion. The most important and unique thing to recognize about the actual religion of Bokonism, though, is that it openly admits it's all made up, like in the first line. This, withstanding, it still brings an immense amount of comfort to the people of the island. This, in my opinion, serves as excellent commentary on religion, as it shows that religion really doesn't have to be true. It just needs to get people together and give them hope. The thing is, though, the effect that Bokonon has on the story is actually very distinct from the actual quotes we hear from him. And that's like the actual quotes are like in chapter 3 of the book Folly. The audience is told that while Bokonon does not try to warn us against searching for meaning, he does simply note that you're not going to find it. It's going to be fruitless. This draws parallels to, obviously, Camus. The absurd is not just, wow, the world's weird. It is the connection between humans looking for meaning and, again, the universe not really giving us any. This is why, personally, I don't really like Bokonon as a character, because I feel like Vonnegut used him to not only serve as a metaphor for like a religious prophet, he also used him as a metaphor for, or as a tool to insert Vonnegut's own meanings through quotes. I may just be me, but I found this really frustrating during the analysis, as I was constantly having to switch between religious angles and absurdist angles. But again, very well maybe be me. Bokonon is a very powerful character, and while he does have two meanings, in my opinion, both of them are incredibly valuable to the story. Throughout the story, we follow Jonah. Jonah is the POV character of the novel. He is, if not meant to be completely relatable, someone that we could graft our face onto. This is not to say he's lacking character. At one point, in the style very reminiscent of Vonnegut's dry humor, Jonah remarks that he has had, by a reckoning, I once made more than 53 women. We also know that at the start of the novel he is a Christian, but he eventually converts to Bokonism. This will become important in a second. Jonah represents the idea of someone encountering the absurd. He loses his faith near the end of the novel, and this, with the end of the world, leads him in a search for meaning. This is best shown when at the end of the novel he is literally crying to Newt, trying to think of a symbol to bring with him to the top of Mount McCabe. This leads him into his encounter with Bokonon, where he says the final line of the novel, here. Again, Jonah represents someone encountering the absurd. And I think with that, this finishes off characterization. Now, let's take a look at the other literary elements Vonnegut uses to communicate his point. Like any other good author, characterization is not Vonnegut's only tool. Throughout the text, he makes good use of standard literary techniques like tone and dramatic irony to communicate not only his plot, but his message to the audience. Vonnegut's comedic style is the very definition of black humor. None of his jokes are too overbearing, and it never feels like an overly comedic book, but that makes his tiny shots all the funnier. All of his gibes are directed at some part of the human condition. My personal favorite form of this is when he demonstrates something that is actually quite dangerous by showing it to be just incredibly stupid. For instance, when Jonah is visiting Dr. Honecker's lab, the supervisor tells him that they practice pure research. This means research just focused on the edge of human knowledge without an actual some specific goal in mind. He then, of course, clarifies that this is just for money because ideas are the most valuable of commodity. Now, the joke in this comes in when we get some lines about Dr. Honecker. Apparently, while Dr. Honecker was developing the atomic bomb, the most dangerous science known to man, he got really interested in turtles randomly. And he just got obsessed with the idea of if turtles' spines contract or bend when their heads pull into their shells. So he completely stopped all his research and just researched turtles. And the people from the lab literally had to steal his turtles to get him to keep working on the atomic bomb. Now, this almost laugh out loud stupidity is immediately contrasted by a line that comes from the nuclear test between Honecker and one of his colleagues. Science has now known sin, one of the colleagues. And do you know what Father said? He said, what is sin? The use of such a comedic tone following such a harrowing description of a madman is incredibly effective, as it brings to light how silly but also dangerous the mere idea of pure undirected research is, especially just for profit. The humor makes light of the situation, but the light does not only make it brighter, it shows us more of it. Dramatic irony is another way Vonnegut uses classical storytelling techniques to communicate his meaning. Cat's Cradle is written as a retrospective from Jonah, and the most obvious result of this plot device is that the person who is writing the book, the Jonah of the future, knows more about the story than the Jonah of the plot, which means that occasionally future Jonah will pop in and give us a little extra detail on something. This is best exemplified when we first learn about Ice-9 being a hypothetical substance. Jonah, the narrator Jonah, cuts in and says, yeah, it's not hypothetical. Honecker developed it before he died, gave it to his three kids. He reminds us of this fact whenever we see the kids, and it brings to light just how some tension in the story. Like when they're on the plane, they're over the ocean. If the plane crashes, the ice-9 hits the water, world ends. It ends up happening, but we don't know that at the time. So it builds this incredible tension at all times. This is valuable to the story as it makes the audience aware of the mistakes the characters are making as they make them, but it also makes the audience hope that they won't do the stupid thing. This is reminiscent of a Greek tragedy where dramatic irony, we knew that the character's great downfall was going to happen, but we were still on the edge of our seat, screaming at the screen, trying to tell them to not be stupid, but they, of course, are. This brings an extra philosophical meaning as the human search for absurdity, for meaning, is hard-coded almost into our brain. We're all searching for meaning. And an outside observer would be yelling at us to stop and just don't be stupid, but we still search on. We're the outside observer in this book, but this would be like if an outside observer was looking in on us. One final question in the novel remains. What does the cat's cradle, the idea, represent? Well, if I have to be honest, this is very much spelled out in the book. The following is an excerpt from when Newt and Jonah are talking about the painting that Newt makes of a cat's cradle. Newt remained curled in his chair. He held out his painty hands as though a cat's cradle were strung between them. No wonder kids grow up crazy. A cat's cradle is nothing but a bunch of X's between someone's hands. And little kids look and look at all those X's. And? No damn cat, no damn cradle. Julian Castle later remarks, so this is a picture of the meaninglessness of it all. I couldn't agree more. He then picks it up and throws it off a waterfall. It's a weird book, man. This quite spells out the meaning of Cat's Cradle. Cat's Cradle represents the meaninglessness of the universe. The phrase, no damn cat, no damn cradle, represents people looking out at the universe and trying to understand this meaninglessness, and they never can. This phrase is used in situations where people are trying to find meaning in their life, like when Angela is in an abusive relationship, Newt says that about it, or when Castle is talking about the religion of Bokenism. It's ways people are trying to find meaning, but there's none there. Now, this ties all of our pieces together. At last, we can very clearly see the connection between the absurd and Cat's Cradle. It's down to the very title. The very title of Cat's Cradle is about the meaninglessness of the universe and how people react to it. People can accept it, deny it, they can deify it, or they can try to understand it, but they can never escape it. Even down to the very idea of an artist painting a picture of meaninglessness is Camusian, which is my favorite word ever. As Camus puts it, the work that embodies an intellectual drama. The absurd work illustrates through renouncing of its prestige and in the resignation of being no more than the intelligence that works up appearances and covers with images what has no reason. If the world were clear, art would not exist. The absurd artwork simply shows things as they are. It doesn't try to provide meaning. It's just simply a picture of something, of what the artist can see. The art and the artist exemplifies the idea of the absurd person. And, as I've said earlier, of course this comes from Newt. Cat's Cradle is a book about the absurd. Each of the characters in the novel has a different way of dealing with this meaninglessness. Frank tries to explain the world with science, but is left unsatisfied. The people of the island try to explain with religion, but it doesn't improve their standards of living. Finally, Newt represents the absurd approach. He accepts that there is no meaning to the world, and he lives not only normally, but better because of it, even with the cards stacked against him. Now, Cat's Cradle, in the end, leads the audience to the same place Jonah is at the end of the novel, into their encounter with the absurd. It is also a cautionary tale, a tale of what will happen if we keep fruitlessly searching for meaning. We'll never find it, and we'll destroy ourselves in the process. This is the theme. This is the message of Cat's Cradle, and it's parallel to the moral of the myth of Sisyphus. There is no great meaning to life, and that is okay. Instead of fruitlessly searching for some fantasy meaning, we should live in revolt of the idea of meaninglessness. We should live happy and live free because what else is there to do? And if we don't, we'll tear ourselves apart. In the end, we should be like Newt. We live our lives happy in spite of the weight we have to bear. Like Sisyphus, we need to find joy in spite of the toil